Most men believe dating is a game of personality. Be kind, be funny, be interesting, and eventually, someone will choose you. But modern dating data tells a very different story. On many dating apps, a small minority of men receive the vast majority of female attention, while most men struggle to get noticed at all. In other words, attraction doesn't appear to be evenly distributed. It follows something far more brutal, a pattern economists call the Pareto distribution, the famous 80-20 rule. But the real question isn't whether this pattern exists. The real question is why it exists. For years, the idea of the 80-20 rule in dating has spread across the internet. The claim is simple and incredibly controversial, that roughly 80% of women are competing for the top 20% of men. For some people, this idea sounds exaggerated. For others, it perfectly explains their experience with modern dating. Because when you look at the patterns emerging from dating apps, social media, and real-world observations, something interesting begins to appear. A small group of men receives the majority of attention. Most men receive very little. But the real story isn't simply that this pattern exists. The real story is why it happens. Is it biology? Is it technology? Is it psychology? Or is it something deeper about how attraction and status work between men and women? Because once you begin to understand the forces shaping modern dating, the 80-20 rule stops looking like a cynical internet theory and starts revealing something much more interesting about human nature itself. So to understand modern dating, we first need to start with the observation that made this idea so famous in the first place. For many men, the experience begins the same way. They download a dating app, create a profile, upload their best photos, and wait to see what happens. At first, the expectation is simple. If you're reasonably attractive, reasonably interesting, and reasonably normal, you should receive at least a decent amount of attention. But for many men, that isn't what happens. Instead, they discover something surprising. Days go by with very few matches, sometimes none at all. Meanwhile, they hear stories of other men receiving dozens, sometimes even hundreds of matches. And this is where many people first start noticing a strange pattern. Attention in dating doesn't seem to be distributed evenly. Some men receive a disproportionate amount of interest, while the majority compete for very little. But this pattern isn't unique to dating. In fact, it appears everywhere in human systems. In economics, a small number of companies produce most of the profits. In music, a small number of artists receive most of the streams. In social networks, a small number of people attract most of the attention. This kind of distribution is known as a Pareto distribution, where a minority of inputs produce the majority of outcomes. And when researchers began analyzing large data sets from dating platforms, they started noticing something very similar. Female attention tended to concentrate on a relatively small percentage of men, which raises an important question. If attraction tends to concentrate around a minority of men, why does it work that way in the first place? To understand why attraction often concentrates around a smaller group of men, we have to step away from modern dating apps for a moment and look at something much older, human biology. Throughout most of human history, reproduction has never carried the same cost for men and women. For men, reproduction required relatively little biological investment. But for women, the stakes were dramatically higher. Pregnancy meant 9 months of physical vulnerability, followed by years of child-rearing and protection. From an evolutionary perspective, choosing the wrong partner could carry enormous consequences. Because of this, female attraction evolved to be far more selective. This idea is known in evolutionary psychology as parental investment theory. The sex that invests more in reproduction tends to become more selective when choosing a mate. Across most species, including humans, that role primarily falls to females. This does not mean women consciously think about reproduction when choosing partners today, but the psychological tendencies shaped by millions of years of evolution did not simply disappear when modern society changed. They still influence what feels attractive and what does not. Traits that historically signaled strength, competence, and the ability to provide or protect often became attractive signals. Confidence, status, leadership, social dominance, and emotional stability all communicate something important on a subconscious level. They suggest that the man can handle challenges, compete successfully with other men, and maintain stability in uncertain environments. Over thousands of years, these traits became deeply connected to how attraction works. This means attraction was never designed to distribute itself evenly across all men. Instead, it naturally concentrates around those who appear most capable within a given social environment. In other words, long before dating apps existed, attraction was already shaped by hierarchies of competence and status. But while these biological tendencies have existed for thousands of years, something in modern dating has dramatically amplified them. And that amplification is where the real story begins. When people hear the phrase top 20% of men, they often imagine something very specific. They picture male models, celebrities, or genetically perfect men with exceptional looks. But this interpretation misses something important. In reality, the men who receive the most attention are not always the most physically attractive ones. What places a man into that upper tier is usually a combination of traits that signal value within a social environment. Physical appearance certainly plays a role, especially in first impressions, but attraction rarely operates on looks alone. Confidence, charisma, competence, ambition, and social presence often matter just as much, if not more. A man who carries himself with certainty, communicates clearly, and moves through social situations with ease will often be perceived as more attractive than someone who may technically look better but appears uncertain or passive. This is because attraction does not function like a simple checklist of traits. Instead, it works more like a status perception system. People constantly read subtle signals about where someone stands within a social hierarchy. These signals can come from body language, tone of voice, decisiveness, humor, leadership, and the way others respond to that person in social settings. As a result, the top 20% is not simply a group of men with the best genetics. It is more accurately a group of men who appear highly valuable within their environment. In one social circle, this might be the ambitious entrepreneur. In another, it might be the charismatic athlete, the confident artist, or the man who naturally leads conversations and social situations. This is why two men with similar physical attractiveness can experience completely different outcomes in dating. One may struggle to attract attention, while the other seems to draw interest effortlessly. The difference is often not their appearance, but the signals they project about competence, confidence, and social standing. And this is where modern dating begins to introduce another powerful force. Because while attraction has always been influenced by social hierarchies, the way those hierarchies are perceived has changed dramatically in the digital age. Dating apps, social media, and constant comparison have created an environment where the highest status signals are amplified more than ever before. For most of human history, dating did not happen inside massive digital marketplaces. It happened inside relatively small social environments. People met through friends, workplaces, neighborhoods, schools, and social circles. This meant that attraction was shaped not only by appearance, but also by familiarity, personality, shared experiences, and reputation within a community. Over time, people had many opportunities to observe each other in different contexts, and attraction could develop gradually. Dating apps changed that environment almost overnight. Instead of interacting within small social networks, people suddenly found themselves in what is essentially a global marketplace of profiles. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of potential partners appear within minutes, all competing for attention at the same time. In that kind of environment, the way people make decisions inevitably changes. When choices are limited, people evaluate more carefully. But when choices appear nearly infinite, the brain begins to filter aggressively. Instead of slowly discovering someone's personality, people rely on quick visual impressions and simple signals that help them sort through the overwhelming number of options. A few photos, a short bio, and a fraction of a second of attention often determine whether someone gets a chance or disappears into the background. This environment naturally amplifies the visibility of the most attractive profiles. Men who already signal high confidence, strong physical appearance, or high-status lifestyles tend to stand out immediately. Because they receive more likes and matches, the algorithms behind these platforms often show them even more frequently, which further increases their visibility. Meanwhile, men who receive fewer initial responses are shown less often, making it even harder for them to gain attention. In other words, dating apps unintentionally create a feedback loop of attention. The profiles that perform well early become even more visible, while others gradually fade into the background. Over time, this can make the distribution of attention appear extremely uneven, reinforcing the perception that a small percentage of men receive the majority of female interest. This doesn't necessarily mean that women suddenly became more selective than in the past. Rather, the environment itself changed. Dating apps compress first impressions into a few seconds, remove the social context that once allowed attraction to develop gradually, and expose people to an endless stream of comparisons. And when attraction is filtered through an environment built around speed, visuals, and constant comparison, the natural hierarchies that already existed in human attraction become dramatically more visible. But once this dynamic begins, it doesn't simply stay confined to dating apps. It starts to shape how people experience dating itself, creating a powerful psychological feedback loop. Once this dynamic begins, it doesn't stay limited to dating apps. It starts to shape how men experience dating itself, and over time, it can create a powerful psychological feedback loop. For the small percentage of men who receive a lot of attention, the experience tends to reinforce itself. They receive more matches, more conversations, more dates, and more validation. Over time, this naturally builds confidence. Social skills improve. They become more comfortable flirting, leading interactions, and navigating romantic situations. In other words, success in dating tends to produce even more success. But for many other men, the experience can unfold very differently. When matches are rare, conversations are short, or attention simply doesn't appear, the feedback the system provides is almost entirely negative. Over time, this can affect how a man sees himself. Confidence drops. Interactions become more hesitant. Some men start overthinking every message, every profile picture, every small detail of their behavior. And the irony is that hesitation itself can reduce attraction even further. Confidence, decisiveness, and relaxed social energy are traits that tend to create attraction. But those traits are easier to express when someone already feels successful. When the experience repeatedly signals failure, it becomes harder to project those same qualities. This is how the hierarchy begins to reinforce itself. The men who are already doing well gain even more experience and confidence, while those who struggle receive fewer opportunities to develop the same social momentum. Over time, the gap between the two groups can begin to feel much larger than it actually is. For many men, this creates the impression that the entire system is permanently stacked against them. But that interpretation misses an important detail. What we are seeing is not just a biological pattern or a technological one. It is also a psychological process where confidence, experience, and perception continuously influence each other. And once you begin to understand that feedback loop, an even more important question appears, because the visible competition that dominates dating apps is mostly happening during the earliest stage of attraction. But long-term relationships often follow a very different pattern. One of the biggest misunderstandings around the 80-20 rule is the assumption that the same dynamics that dominate initial attraction also determine long-term relationships. But when researchers look at actual relationship patterns in the real world, the picture becomes more nuanced. While attention on dating apps may concentrate around a smaller percentage of men, most long-term relationships still form between people who are relatively similar in overall attractiveness, lifestyle, and social standing. Psychologists often refer to this as a sortative pairing. In simple terms, people tend to form relationships with partners who are roughly within their own range of attractiveness and compatibility. This happens for several reasons. In long-term relationships, attraction is only one part of the equation. Stability, emotional reliability, shared values, and mutual investment begin to matter far more than quick visual appeal. Traits that may not dominate in a fast-paced swipe environment, patience, consistency, emotional maturity, become much more important when two people are actually building a life together. In other words, the intense competition that many men observe on dating apps is often concentrated in the earliest stage of attraction, where visual impressions dominate and people make decisions quickly. But once relationships begin forming in the real world, the criteria shift. This doesn't mean the hierarchy disappears. Attraction and status still influence how people perceive each other. But it does mean that the dramatic imbalance people see in online environments doesn't always translate perfectly into long-term outcomes. And understanding this distinction is important because it reveals something many frustrated men overlook. The 80-20 dynamic may shape who receives the most attention at first, but it does not fully determine who ultimately builds meaningful relationships. Which raises another question that rarely gets discussed. If the hierarchy exists, and if attention naturally concentrates around certain men, how should men actually respond to that reality? When many men first encounter the idea of the 80-20 rule, their reaction is often the same. They conclude that the system is fundamentally unfair. If most women prefer a smaller group of men, then it can begin to feel as if the outcome is already decided before the game even starts. But this interpretation contains a subtle mistake, because hierarchies like this exist in almost every area of human life. In sports, a small percentage of athletes dominate the highest levels of competition. In business, a small number of entrepreneurs build the largest companies. In music, a handful of artists receive the majority of global attention. The same pattern appears again and again, because human systems naturally tend to concentrate attention and success around those who perform at the highest level within a given environment. Dating is not an exception to that pattern. The real mistake many men make is assuming that the hierarchy itself is the problem, rather than asking how hierarchies actually function. Status is not always fixed, and the qualities that influence attraction are not purely genetic. Social confidence can be developed. Physical presence can be improved. Competence and purpose can be built over time. In other words, the hierarchy that many men see as a wall is often better understood as a gradient. Some men move upward in that gradient through years of developing their careers, their physical health, their social intelligence, and their sense of direction. Others remain stuck in the same position because they assume the structure itself makes improvement impossible. Once that distinction becomes clear, the conversation about the 80-20 rule changes completely. The question stops being whether the hierarchy exists and becomes something much more practical. If attraction tends to concentrate around certain signals of value, then what exactly are those signals? And how does a man begin to develop them? The first factor is physical presence. This does not mean a man needs perfect genetics or model-level looks, but physical fitness, posture, grooming, and the way someone carries themselves all send immediate signals about discipline and self-respect. Humans are extremely sensitive to these signals. A man who appears healthy, strong, and comfortable in his own body will almost always create a stronger first impression than someone who neglects these areas. The second factor is confidence and decisiveness. Many men underestimate how powerful these traits are. Confidence does not mean arrogance or loud behavior. It simply means moving through the world with a sense of direction. Speaking clearly, making decisions, and remaining calm in uncertain situations all communicate psychological stability. These signals often matter more than raw attractiveness because they suggest that the man can handle pressure and lead when necessary. The third factor is social proof. People naturally pay attention to how others respond to someone. If a man is respected in his social circle, if people enjoy being around him, if he is comfortable in group settings, this immediately raises his perceived value. Humans evolved as social creatures, and we constantly read the reactions of others as cues about who holds influence within a group. Another major factor is purpose and ambition. A man who is moving towards something meaningful tends to carry a different kind of energy. It might be a career, a creative pursuit, entrepreneurship, or a personal mission that gives his life direction. Purpose creates focus, and focus often creates competence. Over time, competence naturally produces status. Finally, there is emotional stability. This quality is often overlooked, but it is extremely important. A man who remains composed under stress, who does not react impulsively to every emotional fluctuation, and who can handle rejection without collapsing, demonstrates a kind of psychological strength that many women find deeply attractive. Taken together, these signals communicate something powerful on a subconscious level. They suggest that the man is capable of navigating life successfully, and that perception, more than any single trait, is often what places someone into the category people loosely describe as the top 20%. But when we look at these traits more closely, an interesting pattern begins to emerge, because none of them are purely about external success. At a deeper level, they all reflect something happening inside the individual himself, and that leads us to a much more philosophical question about the nature of attraction and personal development. The hierarchy we see in attraction is not just a social phenomenon. It is also a reflection of how human beings respond to challenge. Throughout history, philosophers have often described life as a process of development through resistance. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, argued that growth often emerges through struggle, through the constant effort to overcome limitations and transform oneself. In a very different way, Carl Jung described something similar with his idea of individuation, the lifelong process through which a person becomes more complete, more grounded, and more integrated. Seen from this perspective, the hierarchy that exists in dating is not simply a system that rewards a small group of men and punishes everyone else. It is also a mirror. It reflects qualities that tend to signal competence, stability, and direction in life. This does not mean that attraction is a perfect or morally pure system. Like any human system, it can be distorted by culture, technology, and unrealistic comparisons. But beneath those distortions, the underlying signals remain remarkably consistent. Confidence often grows from experience. Competence grows from effort. Purpose grows from choosing a direction and committing to it over time. In other words, many of the traits that influence attraction are not traits that appear instantly. They are traits that slowly develop as a man builds his life, confronts difficulties, and becomes more capable in the process. And when we look at it that way, the hierarchy begins to look less like a rigid wall and more like a long path of personal development, which leads to the final question that sits beneath the entire discussion. If attraction tends to reward certain qualities, what ultimately determines whether a man develops them or not? So when people talk about the 80-20 rule in dating, the conversation often turns into an argument about fairness. Some men see it as proof that modern dating is broken. Others dismiss the idea entirely and claim the pattern is exaggerated. But the deeper question is not whether the distribution exists. The deeper question is how a man responds once he understands it. Because the hierarchy we see in dating is not entirely fixed. Many of the signals that influence attraction, physical presence, confidence, competence, purpose, emotional stability, are not traits people are simply born with. They are traits that develop slowly through experience, discipline, and exposure to challenge. And this is where the real divide between men often appears. Some men encounter rejection or difficulty and conclude that the system is hopelessly stacked against them. Over time, frustration turns into resignation. Other men experience the same reality but respond differently. They begin improving their health, developing their social confidence, building competence in their work, and slowly shaping a life that carries direction and momentum. In other words, the hierarchy itself does not determine who rises within it. Response does, because the traits that tend to create attraction are often the same traits that create a meaningful and capable life in general. Which means the most important question behind the entire discussion was never really about women, dating apps, or the 80-20 rule. The real question is much simpler. Who do you decide to become in response to the challenge?